Visionary. By Douglas Milewski. Elemental P. United States. Copyright 2016 by Douglas Milewski. All rights reserved. Chapter 7. Baroness Paget frequently sent us refugees. On my third morning there, we received a family of Mormons who did not want to resettle. I pity the Mormons, who somehow made themselves more hated than the Mohammedans. Some years back they had tried trekking to some new and God-ordained place, but the interior tore them to pieces before the Red Indians did. For years afterwards, ragged groups struggled out of that insanity, desperate for any return to civilization. Nobody bothered counting the dead. These days, Mormons were so unwelcome that the church had set up separate towns for them. All Mormons had to go to those towns, like it or not. They were to receive their own state-given place, and what they received was too horrible for any moral man to contemplate. If I had known the truth, I would never have stood by in silence, but I was as ignorant as anyone else, or at least as willing to ignore what I saw. I accepted their bad fortune as a shim between myself and a similar bad fate. It was better that someone else get eaten by the lions. After settling those Mormons in, I went back to 101 to find Cymbeline tuning her piano. It wasn't a special piano or anything. I suspect that someone had moved out sometime in the past and left the piano there. On any day she might have the thing opened up, doing her best to fix yet another problem, banging on it, driving me crazy as I tried to write. I couldn't hear the problem, no matter how much she tried to explain. "Why do you play this thing all the time?" Cymbeline sighed more to herself than me. She searched for something inside. "This might seem like too much to you, but I never had a real home before. I always slept where my mother put me. I dreamed of a little house with a yard and a dog, maybe some chickens and ducks. I would get a little Scotty dog. They are ever so darling, and they fit so nicely on your lap. I would have a sewing machine, an electric one. I would make all the kids' outfits that match the drapes. I would make dresses for myself too, out of good linen, not chintz. I would have a new kitchen, all white, enamel with terracotta tiles on the wall. The icebox would match the tiles. When my mother finally remarried, when we finally had money, she shipped me off to boarding school. To be honest, it wasn't home. All that's gone now. The one thing that I have now is a piano, if only for a little while. That's what made this a proper house. Every proper house had a piano in the living room. All proper girls learn to play one. When I play the piano for a little while, I get to be proper. She was already more proper than most women that I knew. I didn't see how a piano could possibly help. I reached out and tinkled a few keys. "I don't know how to play." Her hand reacted like a viper. Her nails dug into my skin like fangs as she pulled my hand away. She held that grip for a moment, then relaxed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that. It's just don't touch my keys. Not when I'm playing." I withdrew my hand. "Okay, I'm sorry." Joe looked out from his sports page. "Personally, I love listening to Cymbeline play. You'd think that two angels were at the Ivories. Most piano players are hacks like me, some are artists, but Cymbeline, she's an athlete. She's like watching the Bambino. It's a home run every time and it looks so easy. If she could score points, I'd always want her on my team." Cymbeline blushed at Joe's praise. "I used to play for dance studios. I'm very good, but as much as Joe adores my playing, I'm no concert pianist. I like the piano, adore it really. I like the way that all those keys fit together, but beyond a certain point, a job gets to be a job. Every piano sounded wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. Then the dancers all said that I played like a player piano. They refused to dance if I was playing, so I quit. I played for moving pictures after that, which is where I learned the organ, but I kept getting bumped in favor of men. Every time some new boy from the conservatory came around, they would bump me in the schedule, the owner giving him the work because he was a man, and I didn't need the work as much because I was a woman. So now I'm a church organist, and that's been working out pretty well." As a second job, Cymbeline played organ at the Curtis Bay Episcopal Church. In addition to Sundays, she played for choir practice on Thursday nights and practiced on her own on Monday mornings. Most of the times I didn't bother accompanying her, as I rather dislike organs. When I was in college, I remember putting my hands over my ears sometimes. It was so bad that the Clarks could only take me to services without music, but it wasn't music that set me off, just organs. That faded with time, or maybe I grew a thicker skin, so now I just tolerated my way through services. That Thursday, Cymbeline invited me to organ practice and I went despite my misgivings. The weather was warmer now and the walking far more pleasant. The air smelled like spring. She took my arm as we walked, clutching ever so lightly. Women still wore gloves in those days, even when they were not necessary. As we walked, we talked of liturgical music, a conversation that left me mute. I never paid much attention to music. I did not know the names of the hymns when they were played, or even which were the most popular. I figured that songs were a way of distracting the congregation as the ceremony plodded along. All that standing and sitting and kneeling were there in the ceremony to keep you from getting too complacent, but instead of staying engaged, the congregation learned the routine, successfully standing and sitting and kneeling with no more thought than turning a door handle. In contrast, a congregation could never be complacent with singing. Everyone could hear who was singing, so if you didn't sing, they knew it. I never sang. What makes church different than studio playing? Everything. Oh, just everything. The organ by itself is horrible. I feel like it's never good enough for God. But when I play, I feel like God loves me no matter my sins, no matter how bad that organ sounds, and the only division between us is the distance between my fingers and the keys. He's there in heaven and I'm on earth, and yet we can hear each other. When I play, I make the church holy. Can't you feel it? When everything is quiet and serene with the congregation shuffling about just a little, I touch those keys and I summon some small part of God. The tones go through my soul. God inside me resonates with God outside of me, so I feel whole. This music is the only thing that goes through my soul. If it wasn't for transcendence, I couldn't bear to play at church. I had no experience of that. Music to me is just mixed waveforms emanating from vibrating bodies. If there was an experience of God to be had, I had never found it there. When I looked to the place where God was supposed to be, I found only emptiness. Maybe that's what losing Eden means. Eating the fruit of knowledge lost us empathy with God. We gained all the knowledge in the world and lost the one true thing that we needed, and now we do everything that we can to get back the one thing that we can't have. Maybe that's why drugs of pleasure are so addictive. They let you touch God, and once you touch that, you spend your entire life trying to get that pleasure back. Cymbeline pressed a few keys. With the first note of her warm-up, dread struck through me. I felt as if parallel clamps were constricting my chest, attempting to suffocate me. That feeling multiplied with every additional key, with every additional chord. Every note turned the screws. With every bad reaction, a person is supposed to choose fight or flight. With me, there was no decision. My heart was set on flight from the get-go. "I'll be back in a few minutes," I said to Cymbeline, fleeing the pressure. I stepped down from the altar, and I'm sure that she watched me in the mirror that hung above the organ, the one that let her watch the congregation behind her. Once outside, I found air, fresh night air. I collapsed onto the steps, feeling the smooth flagstones beneath my hand. They were real. They were solid. They were not organs. "Holy Mary," I muttered to myself. From there, I found the organ bearable. The noise did not twist my chest out here. Relieved, I found Cymbeline's playing rather beautiful, almost ethereal. The organ triggered memories of my youth. Sitting there on the church steps, I remembered boredom. If you aren't interested in the ceremony before you, which all kids aren't, then church is boring. Kneeling and pretending to pray is boring. Songs in Latin are boring. I wonder how any child can sit there for more than 10 minutes, because as an adult, I can't do that either. I remembered the church that my family used to go to, St. Catherine of Essex Catholic Church, an uncolored building in an uncolored town. Its outside was ashen brick, long ago darkened by the coal fires of the town. Inside was heaven, with the sun creeping in through the dirty windows, lighting up the blue and gold on the ceiling. I remember the Madonna there, in her alcove, standing on the world in her mercy. Her fingers were a little broken, somehow damaged, and so to me they were always broken because they were always that way. In her solemnity, I always found her sad, on the verge of saying something motherly. Our church was built by immigrants working at the textile mill. There is nothing special to be said about this church. It was about as typical a church as one can imagine, built something like the churches of the old world, for it was here to remind the immigrants that they were doing old things in a new place. Half of the windows were still frosted glass, as the congregation had not yet raised enough money to commission more stained glass windows. When I was small, the church seemed a mammoth building, a vast hall conceived and executed to make me feel small and insignificant. That was my relationship with God. He was huge and magnificent, while decorum demanded that you always acted correctly in his presence, lest you offend him, to the doom of the entire congregation. As I journeyed about, I went by that old church once in winter. I found it small for a church, but big enough to let the congregation gather. The front doors showed scorch marks where Fiat Lux had thrown a gasoline bomb because even Catholics weren't Catholic enough, and a few bullet holes in the brickwork because Catholics were Catholics, but otherwise it seemed to be the same place. I stared through the threshold considering whether I should enter, but instead hustled myself along. My father had herded us into that church, all in our Sunday best. In the winter my legs would freeze as I only wore shorts and socks. My brothers and sisters jostled me, fighting for places to kneel down as we were supposed to, and always wanting to turn around to talk to the people behind us, or tapping the kids in front of us and annoying all the parents. My mother never took my father's hand. The only purpose of her hands was to clench your arms like claws because immigrant women didn't wear gloves, digging her nails into your skin to pull you out of her embarrassment. When Cymbeline switched to Ave Maria, I got a feeling like fingernails digging into my soul. That hymn always triggered memories in me, and that night was far worse than most. Bits of my childhood kicked into my conscious mind like a squad of bad cops. I recalled men in suits and priests in stalls, many questions, my own confusion at why I was even there, and the bloody fingers of the weeping Virgin. Cymbeline found me afterwards outside, sitting on the steps. Had it been an hour already? She took my hand. "Jack, what is it? You look like a ghost in there." "Bad memories. I don't want to talk about it." I didn't talk about it either. She had enough sense to back off. So I sat up half the night, unable to sleep, and when I did sleep, I only dreamed of those cracked hands and a word upon my lips that I wanted to say, but found myself unable to speak. The next morning Joe drove away with my manuscript. That story would hit the newsstands soon enough. The editor knew that the Baroness wanted it inserted into the soonest possible issue. I'm sure that the layout man and the typesetters swore from here to Eden, but the Baroness got what she wanted and they liked giving it to her. When Joe and Charlie came back for dinner, they brought an envelope with my pay. That's all that I really needed to know. I had satisfied the Baroness. My first teacher had given me a well done. You treasure those moments, no matter how irrational. As a treat, Joe took me to the dog track, that pagan temple to fortune. I'm not sure which one of us that treat was for, but it certainly wasn't me. I kept a stiff hold on my money while Joe chatted with the other gamblers. It seemed that none of them stopped talking, not even to breathe or to eat, and certainly not for each other. That group defied all known psychology by talking and listening at the same time, yet keeping track of each conversational thread. I found the din overwhelming. Eventually Joe dropped a big stack of money on some dogs, then cheered them on to defeat. God, I thought, suddenly realizing my place in this world. I hope that I wasn't one of those dogs. I suppose that I should talk about the dog races a bit. You have these dogs trained to run as fast as they can the moment that they hear the ring of a bell. So the bell rings, the gates open, and they run. Somebody wins and somebody loses. Do you know who always loses? The dogs. They run their best for several years just to make their trainers happy, and then when the dogs get too old, the trainers kill them. It works that way in capitalism too. That's what it feels like to be one of those dogs. Funny to think of myself that way. The Baroness was betting money on me. I was the dog in her race, dashing after some rabbit that wasn't even a real rabbit. I got thrown some meat while she won the pot. Who was the real winner here? There's nothing that makes you feel low like being the butt of the joke when it comes to successful capitalism. That may sound like a pitch for communism, but that's not the case. When your best option is lousy, you learn to live with lousy. There was a piano in the bar, and Joe sat in front of it. I had some idea that he could play, but I had never actually heard him touch any keys. Cymbeline guarded her piano with the dedication of a polar bear, which even he respected. Joe loosened his fingers up with a ragtime number. He had that dance hall rhythm down. My Uncle Morty owned a beer hall. It was a Schlitz place. Every night they filled the tables with bratwurst, sauerkraut, potatoes, and strudels. Everybody ate and drank and danced, and that's how this country used to be. $1 was $1, you know? We'd have bands come through every night, and when I could, I ditched washing dishes and watched the piano players. Those guys always showed me something, Bird. Later, I snuck in practice time whenever I could. When I got good enough, my uncle hired me to play between bands just to keep the fun up. That was a great time. I loved the money until I learned that I could make better tips behind the bar. After the war, I thought I'd go back and play some more, but the damn church closed down all the beer halls in the name of morality, and as for dance halls, all they wanted was jazz. I can make a passable go at jazz, but all that crazy jungle music makes my fingers go crazy. Don't get me wrong, I love the stuff, but I just can't play it. Really, I was never a good player to begin with. The only thing that I can diminish is myself. When I was young, I was just a kid entertaining drunks, which is pretty easy. Anybody can do that. Nowadays, everybody's drunk and nobody's entertained. You sound well practiced. Thursdays. The only damn day that I get to play is Thursdays. When we got back home, Cymbeline had a cake ready for Joe's birthday. It wasn't one of those perfect cakes that you see in the advertisements. Somehow, she never had that magic domestic touch. She served a 9-inch lemon cake with somewhat lopsided chocolate icing. My birthday isn't until tomorrow. You have to drive the Baroness tomorrow, so today is the day. In celebration, dinner consisted of creamed chipped beef over toast. I don't know what she traded for that chipped beef. I don't remember any birthday parties for myself. I certainly had no birthday parties when I was in school. My grandmother never permitted it, although she would bake me a small cake. One year she allowed Remy to come over and we played with soldiers, waging vast battles up and down the stairs outside the flat. I cannot tell you who won or lost those battles, but I can guarantee you that the death count was epic, which tells me that little boys understood the true nature of modern warfare better than the generals. After dinner, Charlie settled down and listened to his radio. That's when radio was new, and everyone was jumping to get one. Radios were now everywhere. With one word, half the world could now hear you. Imagine the power in that. All that you needed was something to say. On this particular day, some station had hauled their radio equipment to the Symphony Hall, giving us peons a taste of what it was like to be cultured. I'm afraid that the lesson was lost on most of us. What always amazes me about radio waves is how far those things can travel. The music that we were listening to came from down south, almost 1,000 miles away. Sometimes conditions got right, and a tiny signal from a little antenna traveled very far, bouncing in just the right way to get to you. That seems to be a pretty good metaphor for life. We all bounce around, our own little signals, our own little vibrations, landing in the strangest places and heard by the most unlikely people. Who knew that I would be here with a theosopher, a monk, and a gambler, all happily listening to a symphony? What weird signals there were in this world.